The water came at 4 in the morning, and by the time Foster Lange stood on his porch in his bare feet, the lower pasture had already disappeared beneath a sheet of brown, churning runoff that carried fence posts and drowned hay bales toward the creek like debris from a shipwreck. He did not shout. He did not curse the dark shapes of sprinkler heads glinting along the ridge that had been retrofitted, without his knowledge, to drain directly onto his land. He simply pulled his phone from his robe pocket, pressed record, and began to document, because he had learned, slowly and at great cost, that calm men with evidence win wars that angry men only lose twice. What happened over the following months would strip a homeowners association of its charter, cost its president everything she had built her identity around, and prove that patience, properly aimed, can be sharper than any outburst. But to understand how a flood became a courtroom, you first have to understand the land itself, and the family who never should have had to fight for it. Foster Lange was 58 years old, a broad-shouldered, sun-weathered man with the unhurried gait of someone who had spent his entire life measuring effort against results rather than emotion, and he had inherited Briar Creek Ranch in the same quiet, unceremonious way his father had inherited it from his grandfather nearly 70 years earlier. Elias Lange, Foster's grandfather, had homesteaded the original 210 acres in the years following the Second World War, clearing scrub oak by hand and diverting a modest tributary of Briar Creek to irrigate what would eventually become some of the most fertile bottomland in the county. Foster's father, Harold, had expanded the property to just over 400 acres through the 1970s and 1980s, adding a second well, a hay barn, and a modest but sturdy ranch house that Foster himself had been raised in, had left for a decade of agricultural work in 3 different states, and had ultimately returned to at 31, when Harold's failing knees made the daily work of the ranch impossible for one man alone. Foster had spent the last 27 years there, first alongside his father, and for the last 11, alone since Harold's passing, running a cattle and hay operation that had grown, through nothing flashier than consistency and reinvestment, into land now appraised at just over $6 million. He was not a wealthy man by temperament or habit. He drove a 14-year-old truck, wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and considered a good year one in which nothing broke that he could not fix himself. He was, by every account from neighbors who had known him for decades, the last person anyone would expect to end up the subject of a courtroom battle covered by 3 local news stations. Before any of the trouble began, Briar Creek Ranch existed in a kind of working equilibrium that Foster rarely thought to appreciate until it was threatened. The lower pasture, fed by a shallow, well-managed drainage swale his grandfather had dug by hand and his father had later reinforced with river stone, kept the cattle in clean grass through even the driest months. The upper acreage, timbered along its northern edge, provided windbreak and shade, while a modest solar array Foster had installed 6 years earlier ran the well pumps and kept his overhead low enough that he never carried debt on the operation. He held clean title to every acre, a deed with no encumbrances beyond a single recorded irrigation easement his grandfather had granted a neighboring parcel back in 1958, and a plat map, filed with the county recorder, that had not changed in shape since 1974. None of this land had ever belonged to, bordered, or been governed by any homeowners association, a fact Foster would later repeat so many times, to so many people, that it became something close to a mantra. That equilibrium ended the spring a new development, Talone Ridge Estates, broke ground on the parcel immediately uphill from Briar Creek's northern boundary, and with it came Denise Ashworth, the newly elected president of the Talone Ridge Homeowners Association. Denise was 51, immaculately put together even for a Tuesday morning board walkthrough, and possessed of a particular species of ambition that measured her own worth by the tidiness of the community she had appointed herself to govern. She had run for the board on a platform of protecting property values, a phrase she used so often that several of her neighbors had taken to mouthing it along with her, and she treated the association's design guidelines not as a set of shared aesthetic standards but as an extension of her own authority, one she intended to expand at every opportunity. Talone Ridge's covenants, as written, applied strictly and explicitly to lots within the platted subdivision. Briar Creek Ranch sat outside that boundary entirely, a fact confirmed by the county's own zoning records. Denise, however, had taken one look at the weathered barn roof visible from the new development's back lots, decided it constituted a visual liability to the neighborhood, and begun, within weeks of her election, treating Foster's fence line as though it were merely a technicality standing between her and a tidier view. The first letter arrived in June, printed on Talone Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead despite the fact that Foster had never signed a covenant, paid an association due, or attended a single board meeting in his life. It cited him for exterior storage in violation of community aesthetic standards, a phrase that turned out to mean his grandfather's original hay barn, built in 1951 and visible from the new development's rear cul-de-sac, and it demanded he repaint or replace the structure within 30 days or face further association action. Foster read it twice at his kitchen table, set it beside his coffee, and did what he had done with every piece of paperwork that had ever crossed that table in his adult life. He filed it, dated it, and wrote a single calm reply explaining, with the parcel number and recording information included, that Briar Creek Ranch had never been part of the Talon Ridge Plat and was therefore not subject to its covenants. He sent it certified mail, kept the receipt, and assumed, reasonably, that a simple factual correction would end the matter. It did not. A second letter came 3 weeks later, this one citing unauthorized fencing materials along a boundary line that had not been touched since Harold reinforced it in 1994, and a third followed in early July referencing livestock odor and noise as though cattle grazing on agricultural land were themselves the violation. Foster answered each one the same way, methodically and without heat, building a folder that grew thicker by the week, and he began, almost as an afterthought, photographing his fence lines and barn on the first of every month so that he would have a dated visual record if the letters ever escalated into something requiring more than paper. Neighbors who had known the Lange family for decades started mentioning, in the easy way of small talk at the feed store, that Denise Ashworth had been asking around about him, wanting to know how long he had lived there and whether anyone thought he might be open to sensible boundary adjustments. Foster found the phrase almost funny. There was no boundary to adjust. There was only a woman who had decided his land was hers to critique. By August, Denise had stopped writing letters and started making appearances. She recruited 2 other board members, a soft-spoken man named Roland Ito who mostly nodded along and a retiree named Carla Vance who seemed to relish the drama more than the cause, and the 3 of them began attending the county's monthly zoning advisory session, where Denise stood at the podium during public comment and described Briar Creek Ranch, in front of 40 strangers, as a blight dragging down every home value on our ridge and a property owner who refuses to work with his neighbors in good faith. Foster, who had come to the meeting only because a friend warned him his name might come up, sat quietly through the entire presentation, and when his turn came he stood, thanked the board for their time, and read aloud the parcel boundaries from the county's own zoning map, noting evilly that he had never once been contacted by Talon Ridge outside of certified letters he had answered every time. A few attendees laughed, not unkindly, at the mismatch between Denise's fury and Foster's flat recitation of public record. Denise did not laugh. She sat very still, her jaw tight, and Foster understood, watching her, that he had just made an enemy of a woman who did not know how to lose an audience gracefully. The real damage came in September, and it came without warning. Talon Ridge's developer had installed a stormwater drainage system along the ridge's southern edge as part of the subdivision's final phase, and rather than routing it to the retention basin specified in the original county-approved plans, someone, at Denise's direction, had authorized a contractor to reroute 3 of the outflow lines directly toward the natural swale that fed Briar Creek's lower pasture, a change made without any permit amendment and without notifying Foster or the county engineer's office. The first heavy rain of the season, just over 4 inches in 11 hours, sent the redirected runoff crashing down the slope with nowhere to go, and Foster woke to find 11 acres of his best grazing land submerged, 400 feet of handset fencing torn loose and scattered downstream, 2 calves missing and later found dead a quarter-mile down the creek bed, and roughly 60 round bales of hay, representing nearly a third of his winter feed stock, ruined beyond salvage. He stood in the mud that morning with his phone in his hand, recording the water level against the fence posts, the debris caught in the wire, the 2 calves he would later have to bury himself, and he felt something in himself go quiet and hard in a way it had not gone before. This was no longer a dispute over paint or fence posts. This was 6 figures of tangible loss, caused by a system altered without permit or permission, draining onto land that had never belonged to the association making the decisions. Foster spent that entire day documenting instead of grieving, because he understood, even in the mud, that grief would not rebuild a fence line and it would certainly not hold up in front of a judge. What he needed now was not sympathy. He needed a lawyer who could read a plat map, a permit file, and a drainage easement, and tell him exactly how far Denise Ashworth had overstepped. Foster found his attorney the way he found most things he needed, through a recommendation from someone who had no reason to steer him wrong. His large animal veterinarian, who had come out to confirm cause of death on the 2 drowned calves for the insurance claim, mentioned a name over the tailgate of her truck, Priya Nandakumar, a real estate and land use attorney 2 counties over who had built a modest but formidable practice representing agricultural landowners against exactly the kind of overreach Foster was describing. He called her office the following Monday, and within a week found himself seated across a conference table stacked with his own folders, the certified letters, the dated photographs, the deed, the plat map filed in 1974, and the original 1958 irrigation easement his grandfather had granted, all of it laid out like evidence because, as far as Foster was concerned, that was exactly what it had become. Priya read through the documents with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had seen careless HOA overreach before but rarely with a paper trail this clean, and after nearly 2 hours of review she set down her pen and told him, plainly, that his position was about as strong as she had encountered in 15 years of practice. Briar Creek Ranch sat entirely outside the Talon Ridge Plat boundary, meaning the association had no covenant authority over the property whatsoever, and the stormwater rerouting, since it altered a county-approved drainage plan without an amended permit, likely constituted not just a civil trespass and nuisance but a violation of the county's own stormwater ordinance, exposing both the association and its contractor to liability that went well beyond a simple neighbor dispute. "You haven't been dealing with an HOA complaint," she told him. "You've been dealing with an unpermitted engineering change that happened to flood your property, and they've been sending you letters about paint to distract from that." Foster sat with that for a long moment, and something in his chest loosened slightly, the particular relief of a quiet man finally being told, by someone whose opinion carried legal weight, that he had not imagined the injustice of it. Priya's advice was specific and unambiguous: before filing anything, they needed an airtight evidentiary record, because a judge, she reminded him, does not rule on frustration, only on documentation. So began 6 weeks that Foster would later describe as the strangest of his life, not because the work was unfamiliar but because he had never before applied his rancher's discipline to something as deliberate as building a legal case. He installed 2 weatherproof trail cameras along the northern fence line, angled toward the drainage outflow points, and checked their footage every evening with the same routine he used to check on newborn calves. He kept a bound logbook, dated and timestamped, recording rainfall, runoff volume estimates, and any visible discharge from the rerouted lines, cross-referencing it against the county's public rainfall gauge data so that his numbers could never be dismissed as guesswork. He requested, through Priya, a formal copy of Talon Ridge's approved stormwater permit from the county engineer's office, and the document that came back showed, in black and white, that the retention basin was the only authorized discharge point, with no amendment on file authorizing outflow toward Briar Creek. He photographed the physical outflow pipes themselves, noting the fresh PVC couplings that had clearly been added after the original installation, materials that did not match the weathered gray of the rest of the system, a small detail that would matter more than he yet understood. A survey crew Priya recommended came out and confirmed, with instruments, that the rerouted lines crossed no easement, recorded or otherwise, before spilling onto Lange property. Neighbors on the ridge, several of whom had grown uneasy watching Denise's campaign against a man they'd known for years, began quietly offering their own observations, and Roland Ito, the mild board member who had mostly just nodded along at meetings, admitted to one neighbor over a fence line that he had voted against the rerouting proposal but had been overruled by Denise and Carla in a vote that was never properly noticed to the general membership, a procedural detail Priya flagged immediately as significant. By late October, the case file was thick enough that Priya described it as close to overwhelming, and she laid out, in careful language, exactly what came next and why each step mattered. They would file first for a civil trespass and nuisance claim tied to the unpermitted drainage alteration, seeking damages for the destroyed fencing, lost cattle, and ruined hay, and they would simultaneously file a formal complaint with the county engineer's office, since the unpermitted change was itself a code violation independent of any private lawsuit. Priya was explicit that this was not retaliation dressed up as legality. Every document, every camera angle, every claim would be grounded in something a court could independently verify, because the moment the case became about anger rather than evidence, they would lose the advantage Foster's patience had built. Foster listened, nodded, and signed where she indicated, and for the first time since the flood, he slept through a full night without waking at 3 a.m. to replay the sound of water moving where it should never have gone. The filings became public record in early November, and word reached Talon Ridge within days, as Priya had known it would. Denise Ashworth's response was not caution but escalation, precisely the pattern Priya had predicted when she warned Foster that people who mistake control for competence rarely recognize a losing position until it is far too late to matter. Rather than pause the drainage system or consult the association's own insurance carrier, Denise pushed the board, over Roland's now documented objection, to authorize a second phase of the same rerouting project, intended to handle additional runoff capacity before winter, a decision made in a closed session that violated the association's own bylaws regarding notice to general membership. The new work began the second week of November, expanding the very system that was already the subject of a county complaint, and when the season's first major storm arrived less than 3 weeks later, dropping nearly 6 inches of rain over 2 days, the expanded, still unpermitted system failed catastrophically, sending a volume of water down Briar Creek's slope that this time overtopped Foster's remaining fence line entirely, undercut a support pier on his equipment barn, and left standing water across nearly the whole of the lower pasture for 4 straight days. It was, in the plainest terms Priya could offer him over the phone that night, exactly the consequence they had warned the county about in writing, now arriving with cameras rolling, timestamps recorded, and a paper trail showing the association had been formally notified of the risk and expanded the system anyway. The second flood brought a different kind of warning than the first. Where Foster's initial response had been quiet documentation born of shock, this time he called the county sheriff's non-emergency line before the water had even finished rising, because Priya had told him plainly that once law enforcement generated an official incident report, it became one more piece of independent, third-party evidence no defense attorney could later dismiss as a rancher's grievance. Deputy Marcus Whitlow arrived just after 9 that morning, a lean, unhurried man in his 40s who had grown up 2 towns over and had the particular patience of someone who had spent 2 decades sorting fact from theater in neighbor disputes. He walked the flooded pasture with Foster first, boots sinking into standing water, and took photographs of the undercut barn pier and the torn fencing while Foster narrated the timeline in the same flat, factual register he had used in every letter he'd ever sent Denise. Then, because procedure required hearing both sides, Whitlow drove up to Talon Ridge to speak with the association. Denise met him at her front door already talking, insisting the flooding was a pre-existing drainage issue on the Lange property and that her board had done nothing but try to improve infrastructure for the whole ridge, and Whitlow, who had learned long ago that people who answer questions before they're fully asked are usually the ones with something to protect, simply let her talk while he took notes. When he finally asked the specific question, whether the association had a currently amended county permit authorizing discharge toward Briar Creek, Denise's answer wavered for the first time, sliding from certainty into something closer to improvisation, claiming the contractor had handled all the paperwork and that she wasn't personally familiar with permit specifics, a claim that sat awkwardly beside her earlier insistence that the board had acted responsibly and with full authority. Whitlow thanked her for her time, drove back down the ridge, and told Foster candidly that in his experience, people who couldn't answer a direct yes or no question about their own project usually already knew the answer was no. His incident report, filed that evening, noted the discrepancy plainly, and it would later become one of the more quietly devastating documents in the entire case file, not because it accused anyone of anything, but because it recorded, in an officer's neutral language, exactly how Denise Ashworth's story had begun to fray under the weight of a single simple question. The county engineer's office, already investigating the original complaint, escalated its own inquiry once Whitlow's report crossed their desk, and they sent out a civil engineer named Gregory Aldous to conduct a full technical assessment of the drainage system. Aldous spent 2 days on site, running elevation surveys, examining the pipe couplings Foster had photographed months earlier, and cross-referencing the physical infrastructure against every permit on file for the Talon Ridge development. What he found went beyond the unauthorized rerouting everyone already knew about. The original stormwater retention basin, the one specified in the county-approved plans, had been undersized during construction, built to roughly 60% of its required capacity, a discrepancy Aldous traced back to a change order signed not by the developer's engineer but by Denise Ashworth herself, acting in her capacity as board president during the final phase of construction 18 months earlier, apparently to reduce the basin's footprint and preserve additional buildable lot space at the ridge's edge. In other words, the flooding was not simply the result of a hasty, poorly permitted rerouting decision made in a panic, it was the downstream consequence of a cost-cutting choice Denise had made over a year earlier, one that had made the entire system incapable of handling normal seasonal rainfall even before a single pipe had been redirected toward Foster's land. Aldous's report used careful, technical language, but its implication was unmistakable: the basin had been built too small on purpose, and everything since had been an attempt to manage the consequences of that decision without ever admitting it existed. The reveal of true motive came not from the engineering report but from an unexpected source. Roland Ito, the soft-spoken board member who had quietly objected to the rerouting vote, decided, after Whitlow's incident report became public record through a routine county disclosure request Priya filed, that he no longer wished to carry the weight of what he knew alone. He met with Priya voluntarily, without being subpoenaed, and brought with him a folder of his own, bored email threads he had saved out of what he later called Simple Instinct, in which Denise had written, months before any flooding occurred, that the reduced basin size would let the developers squeeze 2 more lots out of the southern edge and that she had personally recommended the change because, in her own words, nobody downhill is going to notice a few extra feet of runoff. Nobody downhill, at the time she wrote it, meant Foster Lange, whose grazing land sat directly in the runoff's path, though his name appeared nowhere in the email because, as became clear, Denise had never considered him worth naming at all. The emails also revealed that Denise had received a small but real financial benefit from the arrangement, in the form of a reduced special assessment on her own lot in exchange for supporting the developer's reduced basin request, a detail that transformed the entire case from a story about an overzealous HOA president into something closer to a story about a public official quietly trading her neighbor's safety for her own convenience. Word moved through Talon Ridge the way water moves through a drainage system that was never sized correctly to begin with, slowly at first, and then all at once. Neighbors who had stayed silent through the letters, the meetings, and even the first flood began comparing notes once Rowland's emails surfaced in the county's public case file, and several who had privately found Denise's crusade against Foster distasteful but had said nothing out of a desire to avoid conflict now found their silence harder to justify. A woman named Teresa Okafor, who lived 3 lots down from Denise and had lost a retaining wall to erosion the same week as Foster's second flood, started a petition calling for an emergency membership meeting to review the board's financial disclosures, and within days it had more signatures than Talon Ridge's entire declared membership, a discrepancy that raised its own uncomfortable questions about how many names on the original petition supporting Denise's aesthetic campaign against Foster had ever actually been real. By the time the case reached the county courthouse the following spring, it had grown into something considerably larger than a fence line dispute, folding in the original trespass and nuisance claim, the stormwater ordinance violation, and, following Rowland's disclosure, a breach of fiduciary duty claim brought by several Talon Ridge homeowners against Denise personally. The trial, held over 4 days in a courtroom that filled noticeably fuller each morning as word spread through both communities, opened with Priya walking the judge methodically through the timeline Foster had built with his own 2 hands, the letters, the photographs, the trail camera footage, the survey results, the county permit records, and finally Aldis's engineering report and Rowland's emails, laid out not as accusations but as a sequence of dates and documents that told their own story, without requiring embellishment. When Denise took the stand in her own defense, insisting once again that the undersized basin had been a routine cost decision unrelated to any personal benefit, opposing counsel needed only to walk her, line by line, through her own email correspondence, and the courtroom watched her explanations grow thinner with each document placed in front of her, until her assertion that she had acted purely in the community's interest collapsed under the plain, unglamorous weight of her own written words. Judge Miriam Castellano took 11 days to issue her written ruling, and when it arrived with the kind of thoroughness that left no room for appeal on the facts, because she had, as she noted in her opening paragraph, rarely seen a case in which the plaintiff's own restraint did more to establish credibility than any single piece of testimony. She found, point by point, that Talon Ridge Homeowners Association held no covenant authority whatsoever over Briar Creek Ranch, that the original stormwater rerouting constituted an unpermitted alteration in direct violation of the county's drainage ordinance, and that the undersized retention basin, approved by Denise Ashworth in exchange for a reduced personal assessment, represented a clear and documented breach of her fiduciary duty to the very membership she had been elected to serve. She awarded Foster just over $4 million in compensatory damages, covering the destroyed fencing, the lost cattle, the ruined hay, the undercut barn foundation, and the diminished grazing capacity of 11 acres that would take years to fully recover, and she assessed an additional $9 million in punitive damages against both the association and Denise personally, finding that the decision to expand the unpermitted system after receiving formal county notice of the violation constituted, in her words, a level of willful disregard for a neighbor's safety and property that this court cannot allow to stand as a mere cost of doing business. The combined judgment came to just over $13 million, a figure that made the local paper's front page the following morning, but it was a single line near the end of her written opinion that homeowners across 3 counties would go on quoting for months afterward. An association's authority exists to serve its members, not to shield its officers from the consequences of decisions made in their own self-interest, and a title of president confers no immunity from the ordinary duties of honesty owed to one's neighbors. Castellano further ordered the county to revoke Talon Ridge's Homeowners Association charter pending a full compliance audit and reorganization under new, independently elected leadership, effectively dissolving the board as it had existed under Denise's presidency. The fallout moved quickly once the ruling became public record. Denise resigned her position within the week, though the resignation changed little given the charter revocation already underway, and the personal portion of the judgment attached to her own assets, forcing the sale of her home to satisfy a fraction of what she owed, a fact several of her former neighbors noted without much sympathy, given what her decisions had cost the rest of them in special assessments and eroded property values over the preceding year. Roland Ito, whose voluntary disclosure had done more than any single piece of evidence to unravel Denise's defense, was elected to lead the association's interim reorganization committee, a role he approached with the same quiet, careful diligence he had shown in the emails he'd kept, and one of his first acts was to commission an independent engineering review of every drainage structure in the development, funded in part by the settlement itself, to ensure nothing built under the previous board's watch posed a similar risk again. The reorganized association issued a formal written apology to Foster Lange, read into the record at their first public meeting under new leadership, acknowledging both the flooding and the earlier campaign of baseless code complaints as actions the association had no authority to take and deeply regretted having pursued. Restoration of Briar Creek Ranch took most of that following year, though Foster approached the rebuilding with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything else. The damages award covered new fencing along the full northern boundary, engineered this time with reinforced drainage culverts of Foster's own design, built in consultation with Gregory Aldous, who had by then become something closer to a friend than a county official Foster had once met only through a flood. The barn's foundation was repaired and reinforced, the equipment inside replaced, and the 11 acres of damaged pasture were reseeded and rested for a full grazing season before cattle were allowed back onto them, a patience that Foster, of all people, understood better than anyone. By the following spring, the lower pasture had returned to something close to what it had been before any of it started, thick grass along the swale his grandfather had first dug by hand more than 70 years earlier, cattle moving through it in the unhurried rhythm of ordinary ranch life, the trail cameras long since taken down because there was, at last, nothing left that needed watching. Foster still keeps the folder from those months, the original certified letters, Priya's case notes, Deputy Whitlow's incident report, Aldous' engineering findings, and Judge Castellano's full written ruling, stored now not out of vigilance but out of something closer to memory, the way a man might keep the tools his father once used even after they've been replaced by newer ones. He does not talk about the case often, and when neighbors bring it up at the feed store, he tends to change the subject toward weather or cattle prices, not out of bitterness but because he has never been a man inclined to relive a fight once it's finished, only to make sure the land itself remembers what was fair. In the evenings now, when the light goes long and gold across the ridge his grandfather cleared by hand, Foster sometimes walks the fence line simply to walk it, checking nothing in particular, listening to the creek move through the swale the way it always has, the way it was always meant to, before anyone upstream decided the water belonged to them instead of the land it had always been flowing toward. He thinks, on those walks, not of Denise Ashworth or courtrooms or judgments, but of his father and his grandfather, of the quiet, stubborn decency it took to hold a piece of ground for 70 years without once needing to raise your voice to keep it, and he understands now, in a way he could not have before the flood, that the patience his family had always practiced was never passivity at all, but a kind of readiness, waiting for the day it would finally be needed. Land does not ask to be defended, and it does not applaud when it finally is, it simply waits, quiet and unmoved, for the people who love it to prove they were paying attention all along.